As on any historical ghost tour, the question arises, what is real and what is phantasm?
Anne Stafford, the wife of Tom Stafford, whose stories you'll be hearing tonight, confesses that her husband's grip on reality is not always as steady as her own. The author himself told us the following. All the words spoken by Nellie Baumgardner are taken directly from newspaper interviews conducted after she survived that story's famous, or perhaps infamous, bump in the night. Buffalo Bill's 19 visits to Springfield were as real as the pickpockets who followed him to town and the piece of Springfield William Cody took to his first grave. Although Simeon Smith is a character of pure fiction, the words that so haunt him in the story were decidedly unghostly, all having been either spoken or written by Springfield temperance leader Eliza Daniel Stewart. They are as well documented, in fact, as the sufferings of Lieutenant Isaac Strain, an engineer Boggs, chronicled in the March, April, and May 1855 editions of Harper's New Monthly Magazine. If the ghost appearing at the end of the story of the unholy ghost has never before been written about, the Springfield cholera epidemic of 1849 has. So too have the unfortunate words of the Oxford professor who held strong opinions about God's use of the disease to smite those that the professor loathed. Finally, the story of Jess Leffel and his youthful dime filching is one as dear to the author as was the late Mr. Leffel, who spoke of his days as a market boy with a gleam in his eyes during interviews Mr. Stafford trusts you'll all be familiar with the disquieting spirit found there. Now, without further ado, let us walk on into the night.
There are more terrifying things, of course, but for most human beings, the single most consistent, enduring, and intimate source of dis-ease, the thing that disturbs our inner sense of peace and distracts us from the labors of our day, the thing that haunts us from the inside, is our conscience. And for years of his youth, Jess Leffel's conscience was burdened by the weight of the gleaming Mercury head dime. Although mixed somewhere in the middle of 11 poor children whose father was never quite able to support them, Jess, now departed, offers no excuse and volunteers rather that he should have known better. My mother taught her children not to lie, steal, or smoke, he said, then added she didn't even allow playing cards in the house. To help support his family, Jess became one of the market boys who lined up on this esplanade on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays during the 1930s. Here they would line up and await the arrival of sleek luxury cars nearing the city hall and market. Inside were wealthy women who would pay the boys to carry their shopping baskets. There was Alpha Tallis, the wife of Wittenberg College president and First National Bank chairman Rees Edgar Tallis. Alice Pettigrew, whose husband Stanley, a real estate and insurance man, had built a beautiful place on McCrite. Cynthia Weaver, whose husband ran the Ohio Gas Company, once tipped just $2 at Christmas. And Olive Kissel, husband of Ridgewood developer Harry S. Kissel, arrived in a Buick at times when most preferred Packards. Jess remembered Marge Prout, who lived in the Bushnell mansion, as a peach of a woman, and Dr. Paul Martin's wife as a jewel, and said that although she sparked the biggest diamond he'd ever seen, he found Alice Baum and Jonathan Winter's mother to be nice. So nice. Still, like the other boys, he beamed brightest when Carol Geiger, the attorney's wife, smiled and pointed and asked him to carry her basket. It wasn't just that she tipped well, a quarter during the year and a whole $1 at Christmas time. When the holiday came, she also treated the boys to donuts, which they sometimes would eat together while marveling at the technological wonder at the Myers Market next door, the bread slicer. For more than a generation, all innovations competed to be the best thing since sliced bread. Although Jess felt rich, when he returned home on market days, the money went to his family, and on his way home he heard temptation call out from the marquees and the posters at all of Springfield's movie theaters. For a dime, one thin silver dime, he could be entertained for an afternoon in front of a silver screen, and often was. Maybe because of his mother's church-going ways, he clearly recalled seeing King of Kings at Gus Sun's bandbox. Jess so loved movies that at age 8 he began filching dimes whenever he could. Early on he felt bad about it, but as it became habit, he was able to focus on developing the skill and soon became quite an expert filcher. So expert, in fact, that His career stretched over enough years for him to become somewhat of a movie critic. It took 9 years for the accumulating stack of dimes to weigh on his soul, but they did. And on a Sunday in 1936, it came time to pay the piper. While kneeling in prayer at church, Jess began to weep, then weep uncontrollably. Seeing her boy in pain, his mother accompanied him at the altar, and he said, "I confessed all these things to the Lord, and he forgave me." After deciding to become a person of true faith, Jess began to retrace his steps. He visited his old school and began to tell teachers of the times he cheated in their classes. He stopped at the house of a well-to-do woman on Broadmoor to confess that he'd stolen a pack of mints from her car when his father was painting there. A few weeks later, the same woman drove to the Leffel home to ask if he'd also stolen a blanket. By this time, the contrite young man was confessing things he hadn't even done. All this built up to the day he was ready for, his final stop. A visit to Mr. Smith, who drove a delivery route for the W.R. Hackett Produce Company. Likely because he knew of Leffel's family's neediness, Mr. Smith had first invited one of Jess's older brothers and then Jess himself to be a ride-along helper, paying the boys 50 cents, a respectable amount at the time, for their day's work. Jess had known that he should have been grateful. He'd known that when the man left him alone in the truck, it was wrong to take even more, but he couldn't stop himself from nabbing the dimes that would provide his entertainment. Jess found Mr. Smith on the company's loading dock and there unburdened his conscience as he'd done so many times before. Confessing he didn't yet have the dimes with which to repay him, he promised Smith to do so in the months ahead. He thanked me, Jess recalled, and then said not to worry about the money. Jess was much relieved for both having unburdened his conscience and been forgiven his debt. But as he was walking away, Mr. Smith called out. When Jess turned, he saw a broad smile on Smith's face as the man he'd filched from flipped a quarter through the air in his direction. "It lifted me," Jess said. And at that moment, the power of forgiveness to him seemed the best thing since sliced bread.
There's no reason to give it even a moment's thought. But if we do, it requires less than an instant to realize that undertakers must have a set of memories distinctive from the rest of us. That may have been truer in the mid-1800s when William Coles plied his trade here in Springfield, for it was a time when the rate of bodily spoilage driven by ambient temperature could be slowed only by sprinkling saltpeter upon the face or laying a pan of ice upon the body. Coles entered the trade at a time in which the cabinet and the furniture maker was also the coffin maker. Although Springfield later would build an industry on the mass manufacture of metal caskets, in Coles' much smaller Springfield, the making of things exclusively for the dead made far too little an income for a man to make a living. In what seems a quaint practice now, coffins tended to be made to order. The order often placed by a person who would walk into the Coles place of business with a cornstalk that was cut to the length of the person who was to be fit into the coffin. The need for a hasty burial necessitated rough-hewn caskets, though the boxes became a little less crude when Coles and his father began making and storing the coffins ahead of time. The practice allowed time to plane the surfaces smooth and to coat the wood with melted beeswax, which was then scraped off before the surface was rubbed smooth with a piece of cork. The transition to the made-ahead casket was not as smooth. People came into the shop in wild astonishment and wanted to know how it happened that so many people were dying all at once. When I explained, he recalled, the situation, a great many people thought it was an awful thing to anticipate death in that way. We had a new servant girl who, as soon as she saw the room in the shop where the stock of coffins was kept, immediately packed up and went home. In the summer of 1849, Coles and his father had reason to regret that they hadn't yet started making coffins ahead of time. And it was in that same summer that the younger Coles made one of his career's most memorable calls. In the weeks before his visit there, the deep limestone cut west of the city was thought of as a place of promise and progress. Although not as heady as the discovery of gold in California that would mark that year in history, the arrival of Irish crews laying tracks in the cut was a cause for excitement. People who had seen their town grow because of its location at the western end of the National Road knew the prospects of prosperity would grow with the coming of the Big Four Railroad. Machinery built here could be marketed and sold to an expanding market. Crops could be shipped to buyers, lessening the need to distill corn and rye into a form that wouldn't spoil. It represented a connection to the wider world. But the city's excitement over developments in the Deep Cut began to change when the first of the Irish workers began to die. Although better known on the East Coast, cholera was not a stranger to these parts. The decade before, it had claimed 33 lives in nearby New Carlisle. The disease came to the river town of Cincinnati frequently enough in the 19th century summers that many would retreat to the country, some to the community named Mount Healthy. As the summer of 1849 wore on in Springfield and the death toll rose, the Deep Cut was transformed in the citizens' minds into an infected gash that continued to ooze pus and wouldn't heal. Those with the courage to think of it dared not mention aloud the gash's obvious proximity to the city, nor its location in the direct path of the prevailing weather. As for the thought of traveling there, it seemed madness on the very day that Coles reined his crew of horses right in that direction. Guiding them out the National Road, like the route walked by pioneer families, like the one that stands right here, he headed south. When he arrived, he found the cut filled with campfire smoke that clung to the sweat-stained clothing of the railway laborers like the fear that was clinging to their souls. The dead men's recent colleagues cautiously pointed that way toward a crude shanty, but not even those from the Emerald Isle would help Coles put the bodies into the coffin, nor the coffin into the hearse. On account of a fallen tree, he recalled, I could not get the hearse near his door. Though he never mentioned being disturbed by the work, poor Coles had a devil of a time wrestling the corpse into the coffin and then the coffin around the tree and into the hearse. It was prelude to a longer companionship with the corpse that was neither customary nor recommended. For although he was able to return along the National Road to the edge of Springfield, city fathers halted his progress there. So as not to set off panic, he was prevented from transporting the bodies of cholera victims through town during daylight. So Coles had to carefully drive his cargo through town in the dead of night, heading for the Catholic cemetery on the road to Laganda, just east of the city. Cholera itself is an immigrant, of course, now thought to have emigrated from the Sundarbans east of India. Even today, that delta remains a fearsome place, where men who hunt for honey that can support their families for a year are regularly hunted, mauled, and killed by the Bengal tigers. At the time of Cole's memorable errands, long before germ theorists identified the bacteria Vibrio cholerae as the cause of the disease, John W. Scott, a professor of natural philosophy at the University in Oxford, Ohio, had a chilling theory. A theory that the disease resembled a moral force prowling the world like the Bengal tiger. In the authoritative, nay, scientific, and assured tone possessed only by the morally upright, the professor declared that the disease hunts out with extraordinary precision the abodes of vice, the haunts of intemperance, debauchery, and every moral and physical pollution. Not since the flood, and by this Scott meant the biblical flood, has the earth been swept by so universal a scourge, a divine judgment upon men. Of course, it was clear to Scott and others that God had visited his judgment on some more than others, an infected opinion that was spread over the nation by prevailing cultural winds. Early in the epidemic, when the Irish and what was called the colored population were victims, Springfield's newspaper agreed with the learned professor, calling the deaths the result of gross impudence, opining that they could have been prevented with anything like decent cleanliness and care. So far as we can tell, it added with a punch, every disease has been an absolute suicide. Except, of course, those that Scott believed had been hunted down by God Almighty himself. But then came the death of David King, which proved as great an obstacle to the prevailing view as the tree in front of the Irishman's shanty. By industry, economy, and business tact, the newspaper said, King had advanced himself from the position of a friendless orphan child to the possessions of a large fortune which was rapidly increasing when cholera struck. He had, in short, lived the 19th century's manifestation of the American dream, and so surely could not have been a man who had either committed suicide or been dispatched by a divine decree. There, then, followed the death of Cyrus Williams, the beloved chief engineer of the Mad River Lake Erie Railroad. Williams had succumbed after returning to Sandusky, where cholera was also at work, and the prevailing mood changed. Historian Benjamin Prince wrote that by the time the epidemic abated that September, business was dull and all were melancholy, saying the outbreak had thrown everything out of gear. The newspaper urged the city to beg indulgence for shortcomings of all kind and seek out forgiveness. In a tumble-down shanty behind a fallen tree in the deep limestone cut, the troubled ghost of an Irish railroad worker asked for forgiveness, for he found himself unable to pray for those who had so loudly proclaimed that God had unleashed a brutal predator on the sons and daughters of Ireland. And in that state of mind, he wondered what affliction in men could account for their belief in such an unholy ghost.
There are, of course, things that go bump in the night. And while we tend to be more frightened when the cause is unknown to us, there are times when it's better not to know. Nellie Becker learned this lesson more than a century ago during a chill night on which occurred a bump so disturbing to the human soul that it continues to haunt the world today, as I suspect it will haunt all of you tonight. She was Nellie Baumgartner when she grew up in her parents' adjacent home and office in the King Building, 4 floors above where you're standing now. Her father, J.A., supported his family as one of Springfield's most prominent photographers. Photos with the Baumgartner Studios' ornate embossed nameplate can still be found at antique shops and flea markets in the area and fill file folders beneath the towers of the Heritage Center. As much as the Baumgartner images emerge slowly from glass photo plates in the studio, the story of Nellie's haunting emerges from a distant past and land. She had always understood the importance of her husband's work. It was, in fact, Alan Becker's dedication to the Lord, along with his missionary spirit, that drew her to him and their days as members of the Wittenberg College class of 1856. They happily married 2 years after graduation in the city's first Lutheran church where the college had been founded, and then soon left for a posting 8,430 miles away. Nellie was not long off the boat when she discovered that though her heart was with the Lord, she liked neither the oppressive heat nor the reptiles that seemed to flourish in the climes of Guntar, India. She told others she feared most for her children, but the fears seemed to have crept on Nellie's mind as well. After the Beckers lost son Luther to tetanus in 1907, fear sent deeper roots into her mind and began to flourish like the lush flora in which the reptiles concealed themselves. Multiple breakdowns followed, and although Alan did his best to calm her so that together they might continue to do God's work, when illness struck 2-year-old Richard in 1912, Nellie could not bear the idea of losing another child in India. As much as she loved her husband, she longed for home and the security of it, and she resolved to return there. She soon tearfully departed, taking with her ailing Richard, 4-year-old brother Marion, and a disappointed Ruth, who at age 12 had become to love the adventures of India as much as her mother feared them. Alan was unable to make the trip with his family, suffering as he was from lead poisoning that came from handling the type that he used on the printing press that he employed to spread the word. This would prove to be a blessing. Nellie and the children made their way without him from India to England by routes the British had so long used, returned from their colonial crown jewel. While some found the London weather chill in April of 1912, Nellie found it a bracing change. So she and Ruth bundled the little ones up for visits to the London Zoo, St. Paul's Cathedral, and Madame Tussauds' famous wax museum. Nellie was unaware that another Springfield woman, Orpha Westcott, was also visiting London with a child in tow. Mrs. Westcott and her handsome husband Burton had hired the infamous architect Frank Lloyd Wright to design their East High Street home. Nellie had not seen the structure, but figured that if the home resembled the architect's morals, she would not be interested in a visit. The Westcott party was, in fact, planning to cross the Atlantic on the same ship as the Becker party, but Orpha's son fell ill, and she decided to delay the trip. Forward-looking woman that she was, Mrs. Westcott was likely disappointed to miss the maiden voyage of the White Star Line's newest vessel. As disappointed as Ruth Becker was excited to be going, a spirit she did not share with her worrying mother. The ship was 5 days out of Southampton when a nervous Nellie was awakened by what would become a historic bump in the night. She later described it to a reporter from the Springfield News-Sun as a little shock, just short of a grating sound. Then added, "I really believe it was the stopping of the engines that aroused me." Not knowing that the Titanic's hull had been breached, she began to take on fear as the ship began to take on water. Fear, she said, not so much for myself, but for my children. Although assured by a steward that all was well, Nellie remained vigilantly awake, and when she ventured into the hallway for a second time, another steward told her to wake the children and get them to the deck, and then spoke words that chilled her. "Don't take time to dress them." I hastily threw blankets around the little ones and wrapped a blanket around myself, taking time to put on my shoes and those of my children. We hurried to the deck, but there seemed to be little noise and no unusual excitement. When the order came to put on their life preservers, I helped my children into them, and the next order found me ready to give my children a chance for life away from the sinking ship. They were put into one of the boats and carefully tucked in with the blankets all around them. Then the crew began to lower the lifeboats, and I stepped back. In the confusion, I did not notice just which boat they were on, and before I realized it, some of the men and sailors whisked me into one of the boats and it was lowered. Nellie didn't immediately realize that the men who were to perish had whisked her into the right boat, the boat that held her children. Minutes later, they sat together and watched as a placid, nearly lyrical scene of the sort her father might have wished to photograph turned into a cauldron of horror. It was going down very slowly, not fast at all, Nellie said. The night was dark, no moon. The boat was just beautiful. All the lights were on. I thought it was a beautiful night and a terrible sight. Then came the heart-wrenching sounds. The most terrible thing which clings to me yet were the shrieks of the dying just after the boat plunged. We could see men drowning all around. Some could not have been far off. There was no more room in our boat, and helpless as if our hands were tied, we had to sit there and watch men perish. Women in our boat were crying. Men at the oars were sobbing. Those who'd been hurt in the wild scramble were moaning pitifully, and my children were sobbing from fright. For Nellie and all of the other survivors, there followed a silence and a sense of unreality about what had just happened. Bodies were floating about in the water with pieces of wreckage here and there, she said. Other than these, there was not a single thing to indicate where the big ship had gone down. The cold pressed in on their grief and shock. During the excitement, we had lost our blankets and had only our night clothing to protect us. Some of the other passengers shared articles of clothing. We all suffered greatly. Her sole source of comfort was that thought that her husband, as ill as he was safe and would have been counted among the drowning had he been with them. How long the hours were, Nellie recalled. They seemed endless as we sat there and shivered. The next morning, they all saw the sun shining on the side of the RMS Carpathia. But until then, Nellie and her children were forced to endure a series of bumps in the night, all the more terrifying because their cause was known. During those endless hours, bits and pieces of the North Atlantic ice nudged and knocked against the wooden hull of the lifeboat, which rocked precariously above the silent deep, into which slipped the Titanic like a ghost, one that still haunts us today.
The archives of the Clark County Historical Society is home to many documents important to historians, genealogists, and hobbyists. Among them are reports on surveys of cemeteries. For the most part, the report on the Columbia Street Cemetery, the city's oldest, contains what might be expected. It reports, for instance, that city founder James Demet set aside 3 plots for the burial ground in its original plat of the frontier town, and provides a list of the burials along with nuggets of information about some of the interred. We learn that Thomas Jefferson Nepley's life of 5 months and 16 days ended on July 4th, 1837, 51 years after the release of the Declaration of Independence his namesake wrote. Also mentioned is silversmith Charles Bell, whose death led to a coroner's inquest because of pills administered to him the day before, and Barrister C. Anthony, a founding pillar of the legal community. The cemetery also accepted the bodies of 7 Revolutionary War soldiers, described in obituaries of the time as those illustrious and venerated men who fought so nobly and successfully in the just cause of American liberty. Not, as expected, is a statement that Isaac Strain is not buried here. The informed reader subsequently discovers that, though mentioned in the report, neither is Andrew Boggs coffined at this site. On first reading, the news seems as strange as the notion of a 19th century inn proudly announcing that George Washington had never slept there. One reason for this seeming oddity is that the families of both Strain and Boggs are buried in this cemetery. Another, this one not mentioned in the report, is Strain's and Boggs' fame, a fame earned in historic exploration, the details of which will make the flesh crawl. Like his forebears, who migrated to frontier Springfield, Andrew Boggs was a wanderer. His wanderings began when he left Springfield in the 1840s to serve as a Navy quartermaster's clerk during the Mexican War. He later became an engineer and wandered extensively while engaged with the United States Coast Survey before returning to Springfield to put his engineering skills to work, building early Clark County railroads. But it was the opportunity to be a part of a larger venture, an ultimately inspiring piece of transportation infrastructure and an engineering marvel that caused Boggs in 1854 to join the infamous Darien expedition. A second reason for his joining, equally as important, was the opportunity to once again serve with his fellow Springfielder and longtime friend, Lieutenant Isaac Strain. 17 when he left Springfield for the Navy in 1836, Strain rose to the rank of midshipman, led explorations to Brazil and Lower California, and was considered an expert woodsman of the South American forests. So when President Franklin Pierce was considering the nation's manifest destiny, his advisors recommended that Strain lead an expedition to investigate the practicality of building a Central American canal that might cut 8,000 miles off the shipping route separating the nation's east and west coasts. Lieutenant Strain, accompanied by Engineer Boggs and 25 others, landed on the Atlantic shores of the then Colombian province of Darien with a map in hand, a map that was in fact a work of fiction and the ruination of their cause. Given the physical suffering that followed, it seems cruel that the map's source was an Irish physician, Dr. Edward Cullen. The map and Cullen's testimony that the route offered no significant challenge led members of the party to confidently prepare for a 10-day exploration of nature. The intelligence, as it might have been called, left the party totally unprepared for the weeks of hopeless wandering during which nature turned the tables and so thoroughly explored them. Soon after, the men became hopeless lost in an area about 100 miles south and east of the current Panama Canal. Wood ticks began snacking on the top layer of their skin. The men then came under a chemical assault of sorts, for as food ran short and then out, the acid in the palm nuts that they were eating began to eat the enamel off of their teeth. Then came the invasion of what the natives called gusanos de monte. Translated into English, the term means worms of the hills, an innocuous name for a parasite that, though found in the hills, burrows into human and animal flesh, inflicting searing pain as it blazes its trail. As though they were witches without cauldrons, the famished party began to eat raw toads and partially decomposed iguanas. Berries that they were initially avoiding after being sickened by them were later voluntarily consumed to clear their pained, bloated intestines of fiber from the palm nuts. In circumstances that might have led to a total breakdown of discipline, Strain and his officers, Boggs among them, showed courageous leadership, maintaining the party's discipline by disciplining themselves. At first refusing to eat what freshly killed game there was, in deference to the welfare of their followers, the officers gradually acceded to drinking the blood of the animals to keep up their strength in the hot, humid air thick with blood-sucking mosquitoes. With some of his party dead and the others hovering near death, Lieutenant Strain decided to strike out for the Pacific coast with two of his stronger companions in hopes of finding a relief party. In a single page devoted to the Darien expedition in his book about the building of the Panama Canal, historian David McCullough recounts the remarks of the British physician who returned with the rescue party. The doctor called the men sent to their suffering by another physician the most wretched set of human beings he had ever laid eyes on. They were literally skeletons covered with foul ulcers, and nearly all the intellect was in a slight degree affected, as evinced by childish and silly remarks, adding that their memory and the recollections of their sufferings was left completely unimpaired. Near the end of 60 pages it devoted to the expedition in the March, April, and May of 1855, Harper's New Monthly magazine described Isaac Strain's reunion with a sinking Andrew Boggs when the lieutenant returned with a rescue party. Strain advanced a little farther to where Boggs, his old schoolmate and fellow officer, was lying on a ragged counterpane which he had carried instead of a blanket. The poor man had yielded to despair, and the presence of his friend failed to rouse him. Strain knelt over him and exclaimed, "Good God, my dear fellow, don't think of dying. I've brought plenty of provisions. We will soon be on the Pacific. Cheer up, and we will take many a good glass of wine together yet in Springfield." "I don't think I shall die yet," Boggs replied in a low and feeble voice, "but it is fortunate you came as you did, for they had decided to leave me behind tomorrow." Days later, after giving some directions respecting his affairs, the magazine says that Boggs quietly slipped away. Conventional wisdom tells us that cemeteries are haunted at night by the spirits of those buried in them. An alternate theory is that those spirits belong to souls who suffered so greatly during their lifetimes that in death they leave their wrecked bodies behind and return to the burial yards of their kin in search of peace. Only upon arriving do they discover that there are no coffins available for them to rest in, and so at night, when they are visible, must restlessly dart behind monuments whenever the living happen to pass by. We might imagine the spirit of Boggs, who perished while exploring Columbia, leaving his broken body behind in Panama to search out the familiar grounds of the Columbia Street Cemetery. We might also imagine Strain doing the same 3 years later and traveling north to make good on a promise to share, if not a glass of wine, at least pleasant hours in Springfield with his schoolmate and childhood friend. If this were so, a person who spent enough time on the grounds of the Columbia Street Cemetery to assemble a report could accurately say Strain and Boggs are not buried in the ground without denying the two men's obvious presence here on the grounds.
The next day's papers reported that May 24th, 1901 had been the busiest 24 hours the local police have put in for many months. John Romertz, alias the Big Kid, and Joe Wolf, alias Sheeny Mike, both arrived on the Dayton-Springfield-Urbana traction line only to be arrested by patrolmen Basie and Gonder. Bob Darnell, described as an all-around prowler who'd come in from Xenia, joined them in jail. John Linkleiter, known as a pretty clever safecracker, avoided arrest, but was packed off on a Big 4 train and told to keep his capacious feet on other soil for time immemorial. Those may not have been the precise words Detective Hines and Curtin used. Of the more than 20 crooks reported to have been in town, most were dips and hooks, common names for pickpockets. They were in town to take advantage of the many people who'd come to voluntarily open their pockets to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, featuring Annie Oakley, fellow sharpshooter Johnny Baker, and of course, the legendary William Cody himself. Clearly, there are more ghoulish crimes than pickpocketing, robberies of the sort committed in graveyards where officers like Basie, Gonder, Hines, and Curtin tend not to patrol. And it was this specter of such crime that led Buffalo Bill to take a piece of Springfield with him to his grave. Cody clearly had a chance to get to know the city during his 19 visits he made here from 1875 to 1914. As always, there was newspaper coverage. After a February 2nd, 1878 engagement at Black's Opera House, which was located across the street, the paper said the Wild West show filled every seat, a rarity in those days, except during the Murphy meetings that attracted rabid supporters of the growing and energized movement for prohibition. Although Bill's wonderful shooting held the house in breathless admiration that night, the paper's highest praise went to the act that managed to keep the crowd grinning from ear to ear: comic Darby McCune and his donkey, Jack Cass. In 1899, it took 41 rail cars to haul the people and animals needed to reenact the Battle of San Juan Hill. 2 in the cast had actually fought alongside Teddy Roosevelt. The act was so inspiring that the paper predicted it would be several weeks before the small boys of Springfield stopped lassoing everything from the pug dog to the cistern pump, including various members of the family. On August 28, 1907, his hair turned milk white, Cody mesmerized the crowd by riding on a milk white horse and shooting from midair glass balls tossed in front of him. The July 10, 1910 paper praised the Novelty Act, a game of football played on horseback between teams of cowboys and Indians. Anticipating future contests in the NFC East, the report said the game is very exciting and brings prolonged cheers, particularly when the Cowboys get the ball between the goalposts. Cody's last visit to Springfield was September 15th, 1914, while traveling with the Sells Floater Circus. His many appearances here, multiplied by the many towns his Wild West show visited all over the nation, fanned Louisa Cody's worries that once her husband passed into the sunset, grave robbers would come at night and disturb his rest. Texan Larry McCurtry, author of Lonesome Dove, isn't surprised. His book on Cody, The Colonel and Little Missy, is subtitled Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, and the Beginnings of Superstardom in America. The author says Cody was probably one of the most famous Americans of his day, easily more famous than any president, more famous even than Theodore Roosevelt. As another commentator put it, he was bigger than Elvis, whose grave was disturbed. Fortunately, when Cody died June 10, 1917, Springfield's Champion Chemical Company had decades of experience manufacturing a burglar-proof vault as secure as Elvis's second resting place in Graceland. Available in children's, regular, and extra sizes, the vault had been introduced in 1879, the year in which an advertisement warned that 40,000 bodies were being mutilated every year on dissecting tables in medical colleges in the United States. The company called its vault the perfect solution to a problem that has long agitated the public mind. With a heavy angle iron framework, a steel plate on the bottom, and a sheet steel casing on top, its security was ensured by rivets and bolts that were hidden behind an additional layer of iron where grave robbers couldn't get to them. Displaying a fine aesthetic, the ends of the vault displayed letters in finished gold bronze. In a style that would reach its zenith during the career of pocket fisherman promoter Ron Popeil, the advertisement pledged the vault would protect the casket and body not only from grave robbers, but also from dampness, mold and decay, burrowing animals, and vermin. But there was one thing the Champion Company vault couldn't save Cody from: his own stardom, which led to a fight waged over his body by Cody, Wyoming, and Golden, Colorado. A central figure in this fight was Harry Tamman, who was to Buffalo Bill as detractors said Colonel Tom Parker was to Elvis, a manipulative figure cashing in on someone else's superstardom. The editor and publisher of the Denver Post, Tamman had loaned Cody money to cover the massive advertising budget needed to keep the show on the road. Then instead of extending the loan, as others had, sold it lock, stock, and barrel when Cody couldn't pay. Some said it was Tamman's way to force Cody into traveling with the Sells Floater Circus, which Tamman owned. When he and the city of Denver ponied up the money for his funeral and gravesite, the good people of Cody looked at them as shameless partners in crime that had snatched the body of a national hero from the town he founded and named. McCurtry's judgment is that Louisa Cody chose Denver for a simpler reason: that more people were likely to visit her husband's grave near a large city than a small remote town. None of that altered the fact that when he died, the man who embodied the romance of the American West and so often visited here took a piece of Springfield with him to his grave.
Springfield's Eliza Daniel Stewart is known to history by the honorary title of Mother Stewart, a title lovingly bestowed on her by Union troops in return for her tender care that she showered on them while serving as a member of the Sanitary Commission during the Civil War. In the decade that followed, but before she became to him a ghostly specter, Simeon Smith came to believe Stewart was more strongly possessed of another attribute of motherhood. Even when she's not around, he said of Stewart, she seems to be around every corner, her eyes on me, an unrelenting presence. Friends remarked about the eeriness in Smith's voice when he mouthed the words, something that happened with even greater frequency as the 1870s unfolded. During Stewart's rise to power in those years, other Springfielders came to compare the resident of Apple Tree Place with Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. Despite obvious differences, they argued, both showed themselves fully capable of dispassionately laying waste to an enemy of a worthy cause. Stewart waged her best-known campaigns in the 1870s, But she had identified and begun to strategize against her enemies 20 years earlier, when she and husband Hiram founded a Knights Templar Lodge in Piketon, Ohio. And during the Civil War, she came to loathe that enemy that seemed to attack the Union boys that she so loved. Everywhere, she wrote, recruits were coming in and being sent to the front or to drill camp, and everywhere they went was the soul-destroying drink. And so, once the nation had emancipated itself from the sin of slavery, Eliza Stewart began to prosecute a second war, a crusade to emancipate the nation from a slavery to drink. It was in 1874 that Smith, a man who liked his beer, found himself in Mother Stewart's path by simple virtue of being a regular patron of the Laganda House, a virtue that Stewart saw as a vice. Then Springfield's newest hotel, it had trappings that Smith and his fellow imbibers believed made their nightly gatherings of a different sort than the gatherings held by immigrant laborers in rum holes of the muscular manufacturing town soon to be called the Champion City. Though she neither knew Smith nor cared to know him, Stewart did know his view, that there were higher and lower classes of debauchery. It was a view generally held in Springfield and elsewhere. She used it to her strategic advantage when she set siege to the city's choicest establishment. Her strategic instincts served Stewart well in 1873 and 74, during the months she helped to lead what she called the Great Uprising of the Women of Ohio against the liquor crime. With her passion and organizing skills, she made Hillsborough and Washington Courthouse, Ohio, two national flashpoints of the temperance movement. But Stewart had in fact made national news in 1872, when she rose in Judge Miller's Springfield courtroom to help prosecute the suit brought against bartender Barnett Trickler under the Adair Act. The suit sought damages against Trickler for knowingly selling alcohol to Mrs. Hewkins' husband, when Trickler was well aware that the man was an irresponsible drunk and a wife-beater. When the defense attorney, Esquire Spence, thundered that Stewart should have been at home attending to her legitimate duties rather than in a courtroom, Stewart ignored him. Spence's attitude, again shared by so many others, ensured that Stewart's name was printed around the nation when Judge Miller imposed a $100 judgment. Not long after taking up arms against a sea of liquor, Stewart began sensing a sea of change in people's attitudes. All that was lost on Simeon Smith, who did not consider himself and his compatriots among the dissolute fathers and abusive husbands that Stewart concerned herself with. And this gave a false sense of security when Stewart's small army of praying women walked the block from Springfield's Presbyterian Church to the Laganda House in February of 1874. The Laganda House protest involved what Stewart called strategic seating, because once they entered the serving area, the women protesters just sat there. They sat there while the men would have to walk around them, sat as though witnesses in a jury box, about to convict the accused. Sat, thought Smith, like copies of Mother Stewart, who, though off at a temperance battleground elsewhere, seemed nonetheless present. Even her friend and supporter, Clifton M. Nichols, the powerful editor of Springfield's Daily Republic, complained of Stewart's maddening tactics and attitudes. He confessed in the paper that the protesters were not very good at taking hints, and not at all receptive to suggestions, words that when he read them made Smith think again of those qualities in his own mother. Early in the protest, Smith adopted a two-pronged strategy to fight off the anxiety that was taking a hold of him. First, he drank more. Second, he took to singing along with the ladies when they ended their protests with the hymn, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." Smith amused his friends by suggesting that the women's departure was one of those blessings, though one that flowed more than that was found in his glass. The mornings after he joined the ladies in song, and with increasing regularity through the haze of a hangover, Smith began to check the columns of Clifton Nichols' paper to learn what Mother Stewart had been doing the previous day. It was not sitting in silent protest, he soon learned. Instead, the mother on whom he became increasingly fixated was rising to tell stories to the increasing number of women and men in the temperance movement. They were, by and large, horror stories. The first was called A Drunkard's Wife, an only slightly fictionalized account of the Hewkins case. Using the voice of the unfortunate wife, she wrote of a once loving husband who was so changed, so besotted, so embruted by his consuming appetite for liquor as to be an object of loathing and terror to those who once were thrilled with delight by the sound of his approaching footsteps. Stewart collected other such stories at every stop. One involved a man who stole drinking money from his own children and threatened his pregnant wife with a shotgun, causing her to hide one child and send another through the snow to a neighbor's house for help. Another briefer story mentioned children who looked on as their father shot their mother and then himself. Smith never confessed to his fellow imbibers that he was following Mother Stewart's every move, something that created an awkwardness between them that gradually grew wider. Soon, Smith was frequenting the rum holes he had once shunned, a man who looked so disturbed that the ruffians there just left him alone. And so, by the morning, he sensed Mother Stewart next to him, her hair neatly in a bun, her glasses on the bridge of her nose, and there was no one with whom he could share this fearful news. In his isolation, he gradually came to accept and then enjoy her presence, leading to the day that he handed the newspaper to the ghostly figure next to him and politely asked her to read the story so he could hear it in her own voice. It was an excerpt from a piece titled, "Women Have All the Rights They Want," a story forwarding the argument that for women to defeat the liquor trade, they would have to have the vote. Whole nights, the ghost began, a drink-addicted husband had kept his wife and children in terror. For weeks and months it went on until the night he came home insanely drunk, locked the door, took his axe, sharpened the edge, and examined it, and told the children he was going to chop their mother up. He laid her on the floor and went through the motions as if he was going to strike, while the wretched, terrified children dared not resist or protest, and the wife feigned cheerfulness in her response. "Oh, why, John, I know you're only doing this in fun," she said over the thundering sound of her own heartbeat, a thunder that lasted like an unrelenting storm through the long, weary hours of the night, till the effect of the liquor at length overpowered him, and he sank into a beastly stupor. When Smith called his friends together that night, though worried, they were none the less happy, as they had not seen him in some time. Their brittle joy was short-lived. Some laughed at his proposal, sensing their old companion was back, but others, knowing that he was serious, recoiled. "You surely see the logic of it, as she will," he told them. "After all, she is with us when we wake. She is with us when we sleep. She is with us when we work. Is she not also with us when we drink?" As they stepped back, he turned argumentative. "Surely you can see that she is just like Sherman. She will no more quit her campaigning than we will quit our drinking." A silence followed, and the rest filed out. The man, who had been Smith's closest companion to the Lagonda house, said what they were all feeling. "Surely you must be mad." And thus did Simeon Smith go to his grave, a lonely madman dreaming of the day he could have his favorite drink, beer, and talk with his ever-present companion, Mother Stewart, in a tavern and brewery that bore her name.